Okay, hi everyone. Yeah, sorry for the delay. Zoom did an update and apparently I'm having a little trouble trying to stream, so I'm doing it the old-fashioned way on Facebook. So anyway, I'll go ahead and get started here with the healing step session. So we're going to start with many people quietly ask themselves this question: why do I feel guilty setting boundaries? And if you ever said no or told someone you couldn't do something and then almost immediately felt guilty afterward, you're not alone. And you might start wondering, was that too harsh? Did I disappoint someone? Did I just damage the relationship? And sometimes the guilt shows up so quickly that you begin questioning the boundary itself. If that experience feels familiar, there's usually a deeper reason for it. Hello everyone, I'm Janine Naus, Grief and Trauma Relief Specialist, and I'm really glad you're here with me today. Now, whether you're joining live or watching the replay, I'm glad you're here. So once we ask the question, why do I feel guilty setting boundaries? The first place to look is often early conditioning. See, many people who experience guilt when setting boundaries didn't learn that boundaries were normal. They learned something very different. They learned that keeping the peace was more important than expressing their needs. And they learned that saying no might lead to disappointment or tension or conflict. And when those moments happened repeatedly, the nervous system began to adapt. And it started to associate self-protection with risk. So instead of experiencing a boundary as something healthy, the body experiences it as something that could create a problem. And you might say something simple like, I can't do that, or that doesn't work for me. But internally, something else begins to happen. And a voice appears that says, was that too much? Was I too harsh? Did I just upset someone? And almost immediately, guilt follows. Not because the boundary was wrong, but because your nervous system remembers times when expressing yourself did lead to consequences. Maybe someone became angry. Maybe they withdrew. Maybe they accused you of being selfish or unkind. And then over time, those experiences can create a powerful association. Boundaries create problems. So the moment you set one, your system reacts as if it needs to repair something. And that repair attempt often shows up as apologizing, over-explaining, softening the boundary, or even taking it back entirely. And this is why so many people ask themselves, why do I feel guilty when I set boundaries? Because the guilt isn't always about what just happened in the present moment. Often it's connected to what your system learned in the past. The boundary itself may be healthy, but your nervous system is still expecting the old reaction. And understanding that is important because it begins to separate guilt from wrongdoing. Which brings us to the next layer of this pattern. Why boundaries can feel like they threaten connection itself. So, once we understand that boundary guilt often comes from early conditioning, the next layer becomes a little clearer. And for many people, boundaries don't just feel uncomfortable, they can feel like they threaten connection. So if you grew up in environments where relationships felt unpredictable or where approval depended on being agreeable, your nervous system may have learned something very important. Connection must be protected. And in those situations, protecting connection often meant adjusting yourself. You might have learned to stay quiet instead of disagreeing, say yes when you wanted to say no, smooth over tension quickly, or take responsibility for other people's emotions. Now, these adaptations often develop for a very understandable reason, and they help preserve stability in relationships that may have felt fragile. So the nervous system builds an internal rule. Keeping the relationship safe is more important than expressing the boundary. Now fast forward to adulthood, And you might say something simple like, I can't commit to that right now, or I need some time for myself. But the moment you say it, something inside your body reacts, not because the boundary is wrong, but because your system interprets it as a possible threat to connection. And your mind might start scanning for signs. Did I upset them? Are they disappointed? Did I just create distance between us? And when the nervous system perceives a possible rupture in connection, guilt often appears as an attempt to repair it. So guilt can function like an internal signal that says, fix this, smooth this over, make sure that the relationship is still safe. So even when your boundary is reasonable, even when it's healthy, your system may still react as if you've done something wrong. And this is why so many people quietly ask themselves, why do I feel guilty setting boundaries? And because the body isn't just responding to the boundary, it's responding to the possibility of losing connection. And when connection once depended on staying agreeable or accommodating, setting a boundary can feel like stepping into very unfamiliar territory. But here's the important shift to begin noticing. A boundary doesn't automatically destroy connection. Healthy relationships can tolerate limits. In fact, boundaries often make relationships clearer and more stable. But if your nervous system learned that limits created distance or conflict, it may take time for your body to experience that safety again. And that leads us to the final piece of this conversation: how to begin setting boundaries without letting guilt immediately take over. So once we begin to see where boundary guilt comes from, the next step isn't forcing ourselves to ignore the guilt. The next step is rebuilding safety around the boundary itself. Because when your nervous system has learned that limits could threaten connection, setting a boundary can feel like stepping into danger, even when you logically know it's reasonable. So instead of trying to eliminate guilt immediately, it can be more helpful to start by changing the way you interpret it. When guilt appears after you set a boundary, it doesn't always mean you did something wrong. Sometimes it simply means your nervous system is adjusting to something new. And a helpful question you can gently ask yourself in those moments is this: did I do something harmful? Or did I simply protect my energy? And that question creates space. Because protecting your time, your energy, or your emotional capacity is not the same thing as harming someone else. Another gentle shift is remembering that boundaries are not punishments. They are simply information. They let other people know what works for you and what doesn't. For example, a boundary might sound like, I'm not available for that right now. I need some time before I can respond. That doesn't work for me. See, those statements aren't attacks. They are simply expressions of your limits. And while your nervous system may initially react with discomfort, that discomfort doesn't mean the boundary was wrong. It often just means you're practicing a different way of relating, one where your needs are included in the conversation. And then over time, as your nervous system experiences that relationships can survive boundaries, that intense guilt often begins to soften. So not because you forced it away, but because your system gradually learned something new. Connection and boundaries can exist together, and that realization can be incredibly freeing. Which brings us to how we gently close today's conversation. So if you've ever asked yourself, why do I feel guilty setting boundaries? I hope today's conversation helped you see something important. That guilt doesn't always mean you've done something wrong. Often it simply means your nervous system is adjusting to a different way of protecting yourself. And at some point in your life, staying agreeable may have helped preserve connection, reduce conflict, or even keep relationships stable. And your system remembers that. But as you begin to recognize those patterns, something new becomes possible. You can start to separate guilt from wrongdoing and see boundaries as a form of self-respect rather than selfishness. I want to thank you for joining me in today's Healing Step session and for taking a few minutes to explore something many people carry quietly. And if this conversation resonated with you and you'd like a calm space to explore how these patterns show up in your own life, I offer Healing Clarity sessions. And these are gentle, one-on-one conversations where we look at patterns like boundary guilt, people-pleasing, or over-explaining, and I begin separating what your nervous system learned in the past from what actually supports you now. So, they're not therapy, because I'm a life coach, not a therapist, and there's no diagnosing or fixing involved. Just steady space to gain clarity and move forward with more confidence. And whether you explore that or simply take a moment today to notice how your body responds when you set a boundary, that awareness is already a meaningful step. Because boundaries aren't about pushing people away, they're about allowing your needs to exist inside the relationship too. So thank you for being here today. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.